You just got a great view of my neighbor's wall that we're looking out on. And if we get bored in a second, I will show you the 6 chickens that we have in the backyard and the duck that was rescued by the wildlife animal rescue here in El Paso and is being fostered at the O'Rourke House by Molly right now. But you won't get bored, and we probably won't have time to do it because we're about to be joined by Jean Guerrero, who wrote Hatemonger. And let me flip the camera around again so I can show you all what that book looks like. There you go. Hatemonger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. I haven't read the entire book, but I've read a lot of it. And I'm looking forward to listening to Jean, asking her some questions. And we'll try to take your questions as well. If you have questions about Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda, or the chickens and the duck in the backyard, there's a little question button at the bottom of the screen. Cynthia's telling me that Jean is on and that she is posted. Thank you, Cynthia. I am going to invite her on really quickly, but I do want to share this with you all. It's Joe Strummer's birthday today. And if he had not died in 2002, if he was still with us today, he would be 68 years old. And I spent part of the day watching a tribute to Joe Strummer, and it was a tribute and a fundraiser for Save Our Stages. These are all the live music venues and the people who help put on live music that are really struggling right now, as are all small businesses, frankly, in the midst of this pandemic. But some really great tributes to Joe, including from Joe Ely of the Flatlanders of Lubbock, Texas. Bruce Springsteen was on, Jeff Tweedy from Wilco. Anyhow, so it was a really great set. And if it is archived somewhere, you should check it out. But Joe Strummer, wherever you are, happy birthday. And you're my favorite rock and roller. All right, let's find Jean and bring her on. All right. So Jean, I think you've got a request to be on. There should be a little thing that there you go. I'm still new to this. Hey, Jean.
Hi, Beto. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Are you in San Diego right now?
I am, yes.
And what's it like there?
It's pretty hot right now, but it's good. I've just been trying to figure out how to do a book tour entirely from my living room.
Is that doing this on Instagram and Facebook
Exactly.
Live? Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, I'm glad that you're spending some time with us. And I guess I introduced you earlier as the author of Hatemonger, this new book about Stephen Miller and the white nationalism of the Trump administration. But you also wrote a book called Crux, about really a very personal book about your life and your family and what it means to live on both sides of the United States-Mexico border. That got rave reviews. You are, or have been, or tell me if you still are, an investigative journalist with KPBS in San Diego?
I'm not currently with KPBS, but I'm still a journalist covering the border here.
Gotcha. And who do you write for, or who do you report for now?
I freelance for NPR, PBS, a number of different magazines, just a freelancer right now.
Great. So you, like those of us here in El Paso, live on the U.S.-Mexico border, and it's something that it's a topic that's been front and center ever since Donald Trump descended the escalator in the Trump Tower and gave his maiden speech as a candidate for the highest office on the planet. And in that speech talked about the immigrants from Mexico being rapists and criminals. And one of the questions I want to get to, and hope that you can help us to answer, is how much of what we're seeing in American public life today, certainly the racism, the nativism of Donald Trump and Stephen Miller, is new, owing to them and what they brought to this, and how much is a reflection of what people were already thinking and the history of this country from its very beginning. What have Donald Trump and Stephen Miller brought to the conversation that wasn't there before?
Well, that's a really great question. I mean, because it's not an entirely new phenomenon. And, I've been covering the border from the time of the Obama administration, living on the border. And part of the reason I wanted to look at the story of Stephen Miller is because I knew that he was the product of a California that was at the time sort of a microcosm for what we're seeing nationally today. In California in the 90s, when Stephen Miller and I were growing up here, because I grew up a couple hours south of him in San Diego, there was, unprecedented hostility towards immigrants. You saw attacks on bilingual education, you saw statewide attacks on affirmative action, you saw statewide attacks on social services for children of undocumented migrants. So California of the 90s was very different from the California that we see today. I mean, there was just this real tendency to scapegoat immigrants for all of the problems that the state was experiencing. You had Governor Pete Wilson of the time talking about the invasion at the border, running advertisements on television about how these families just keep coming and stealing our resources. And so for me, it was very important to show how Stephen Miller is a product of this environment, because I feel like Stephen Miller is often painted as sort of this aberration, like this evil villain that no one can understand. And the reality is that him and Trump are the logical outcome of a decades-long bipartisan assault on immigration. And Stephen Miller, I mean, what he's been doing is essentially, deliberately inciting the white fear that we had sort of seen a transition away from for a while. Using demonizing rhetoric that he learned as a kid. From a very young age, Stephen Miller was exposed to this, ahistorical idea that everything that we value in American society, freedom, equality, et cetera, that all of these things are products of white men. And, and this is, he was indoctrinated at a very young age when he was going through a hard time with his family. And, and this man named David Horowitz, an ex-Marxist turned right-wing radical, came into his life right when he was feeling, displaced. His family had to move from a very expensive, a very affluent part of Santa Monica to a less affluent part, and radicalized him in these ideas. And so to answer your question, I mean, this is not new. What's going on here, though, with the Trump administration that's different and exceedingly, dangerous is that they're very deliberately inciting white fear. And Stephen Miller is pulling immigration policies and rhetoric directly from think tanks that were created by white supremacists who believe in population control for non-white people. The demonizing rhetoric that you see in this campaign right now, painting the Democratic Party as an existential threat to civilization, that is Stephen Miller pulling directly from white supremacist literature that paints the allies of people of color and the allies of immigrants as an existential threat to civilization. This is dog whistling white genocide, which is what, motivated the horrific massacre that we saw in El Paso last August. This conspiracy theory that white people are being systematically displaced by brown and black people and their allies. And so it's very different in nature because of the fact that Stephen Miller is pulling directly from these white supremacist sources to incite fear and hatred, and to, systematically turn the most vulnerable people away from our border.
Jean, you use the phrase dog whistle. Do you think that maybe they've gone beyond the dog whistle? I feel like the quiet parts are now being said out loud. The intended message that you were supposed to infer, they're now just blatantly laying it out there. The words, you mentioned the precedent for describing immigrants as an invasion, and Trump, and perhaps you'll tell us if it was in part owing to Miller, has moved on to use the phrase infestation, which is how we talk about cockroaches or rats, or something that is less than human that we want to kill. He's talked about asylum seekers and described them as animals. And then certainly beyond the rhetoric, the practices and the policies, taking kids away from their parents, a baby literally out of her mother's arms, placing them in cages and deporting those parents back with no hope or intent of ever connecting the two again. That seems, and I'm sure there are antecedents for this. That seems like something very new to America, although built on, as you said, a long history of nativism that we've seen surprisingly in border states where, because of where we are and who we are, we know better. And it seems like that's a lesson over time that California has learned. And thus far, at least reflected in our elected representation, Texas has not.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm glad that you point this out because, it's not exactly dog whistling anymore. I mean, you see Trump retweeting white supremacists and things like that. I mean, it's very obvious. But there is a key difference though in that Stephen Miller learned at a very young age, as I show in my book, how to launder white supremacist ideas in the language of heritage and the language of economics and the language of national security so that it's palatable to the mainstream. So they insist that they're not racist. They insist that this is not about race for them. And they launder these racist arguments through language about national identity or about needing to protect American jobs or needing to protect Americans from criminals, conflating
Right.
The other with something that is a danger to American society. And that allows them to, appeal to people who don't consider themselves to be racist, who don't consider themselves to be white supremacists by, inciting fear, which according to a strategy paper that I obtained for the book, David Horowitz, Stephen Miller's mentor, told him to remake the Republican Party around demonization of their political opponents and specifically inciting fear instead of hope. He references the political utility of hatred and other hostile emotions and the importance of using fear instead of hope. And this is what happened with the Republican Party. I mean, there was a time in 2012, 2013, 2014 where they were talking about becoming more diverse and more inclusive, and Stephen Miller really took it in the opposite direction. I mean, they looked at analyses about a missing white voter in 2012 and decided that they were going to focus on appealing to white working class by inciting white fear and white hatred towards others. And I just did want to ask you, I mean, I know it must be painful to go over this again and again, but it's just so important to, remember what happened in El Paso. And can you talk a little bit about, how the community has been transformed by what we saw last August?
It's probably a tough question to answer and do the question and the people who've been affected justice. I think sometimes we get trapped by the aspirational language of, this mass murder has just made us more resilient and we are El Paso strong and it's brought out the best in us. All of that is true. And I don't mean to, I've said all those things because I believe all those things, but it really does not begin to describe the pain and suffering that these families live with who have lost their parents or sons and daughters, the people in their lives, for the only reason being the color of their skin, their perceived country of national origin, and the fact that this president, in the topic that we're talking about today, has not dog whistled or signaled, but has explicitly said there's an invasion and they're coming to rape you and kill
Exactly.
you and harm you and take what is yours. And, I remember seeing a clip of a Trump rally in Florida last year before the shooting, where he asks the crowd, what do I do about this invasion? And someone in the crowd yells back, shoot them. And everyone else in the crowd, of course, laughs and cheers and whistles. And the president smirks and smiles as if to give his consent, or not as if to give his consent. And that was picked up by this guy who, purchased a weapon of war to repel the invasion about which he'd been warned, who posted hours before he walked into that Walmart and slaughtered 23 people, a screed or a rant, white nationalist that quotes Donald Trump, or at least echoes the very precise language that the president had been using. I want to ask you a question, though, and I want to be as thoughtful as I can in how I pose this. And I was thinking about it in part because it's Joe Strummer's birthday today. Joe Strummer, frontman of the Clash, who died in 2002. And there's this, one of my favorite Clash songs is Hammersmith Palais. And towards the end of the song, he says, if Adolf Hitler flew in today, they'd send a limousine anyway. The word fascism is being used a lot in this country right now about this president and the administration that he leads. And my existential fear for America is that if we do not prevail in this election, we lose it forever. The republic, our democracy, the ideals to which we aspire that we've never yet achieved, but we've never stopped reaching for. Talk to me about that if you can. It's a big subject, but you know, we talk about the precedents for the nativism and the racism of this white nationalist agenda of Stephen Miller and Donald Trump. What about the antecedents and the precedents of the kind of fascism that he seems to be moving this country towards? Any thoughts on that and how Stephen Miller might be connected to this?
Well, Stephen Miller is absolutely connected because he is probably the most fanatical and extremist person in the White House right now. I truly see him as, you know, a case study in indoctrination, someone who from a very young age was radicalized in this belief that he needed to save the United States from certain destruction in the form of people of color. You know, this fantasy that David Horowitz drilled into his head, as did other extremists and white supremacists and white nationalists that Stephen Miller came into contact throughout his life. And so for Stephen Miller, I mean, he has this fantasy that I don't believe that Trump is an ideologue in the same way that Stephen Miller is. I mean, I think Trump does things for his own personal benefit. We've seen that. And he doesn't necessarily have an ideology. Whereas Stephen Miller, he's very much an extremist who believes, you know, one of the things that I delve into in the book is there's this white supremacist book called The Camp of the Saints, you know, that talks about the destruction of the white world by brown and black people. It's an extremely white supremacist, racist book that Stephen Miller read and was inspired by and promoted in 2015 through Breitbart. That book explicitly promotes and endorses violence and hatred, explicitly hatred towards people of color as a quote unquote survival mechanism against white genocide. So when you examine the fact that the most powerful advisor in the White House right now is Stephen Miller and is an extremist who believes that, you know, he is saving the country by systematically harming, you know, communities of color, systematically demonizing communities of color and their allies, as we see now in Portland, for example. I mean, just the reaction that we've seen from the federal government towards the anti-racist protesters, that has Stephen Miller's name all over it. I mean, he's calling anti-racist Black Lives Matter protesters agitators, anarchists, mobs, the exact same language that you see in this white supremacist book called The Camp of the Saints, which I delved into in the book. And it's meant to rile people up. You know, they talk about, you know, a possible civil war-like fracture. It's like they're trying to rile up these people. And I, as a reporter on the border, I've interviewed these, you know, these extremists on the border who are armed and ready for a revolution, who talk about, you know, going out and killing, you know, Democrats and immigrants. And I mean, these are fantasies that the president is promoting, and which Stephen Miller, through his intentional use of white supremacist literature and rhetoric, is promoting as well. And so I you know, it's going to be, it's definitely troubling to think about what might happen in November if, for example, you know, if he wins or if he doesn't win. I mean, how are they going to react given that they have this very authoritarian stance? I mean, Stephen Miller, one of the ways he's been able to stick around in the White House so long is that he has, from day one, you know, completely bypassed bureaucracies, disregarded the input of national security experts, you know, just reached deep into the bowels of agencies to issue his orders. You know, this is not like the way that government normally operates. But it you know, it speaks to Donald Trump. Donald Trump and Stephen Miller have similar values in that way, where, you know, you just kind of ram through whatever you want with no regard for how it's going to actually impact the American people. I mean, multiple White House officials who I spoke to for the book say that, you know, the way that Stephen Miller approached immigration, which was to narrow the focus of the Department of Homeland Security onto keeping out families rather than, you know, its very broad mandate of protecting Americans from everything from, you know, terrorism to cyber warfare to, you know, right-wing extremists to the pandemic, that left us far more vulnerable to real threats like the, you know, right-wing extremists, which are a majority of the extremists in our country, and like the pandemic.
The corollary or the echo of the Third Reich is so present in so many of the things that you say. An administration organized around fear and enemies and existential enemies based on race and ethnicity. The brown people are coming to get us. The nations of Africa are shithole countries. We want more immigration from Sweden, the whitest place on the face of the planet. And oh, by the way, Ilhan Omar and you know, conflating her candidacy with the 9/11 attacks, which was a video that the president tweeted, or asking Representative Ocasio-Cortez and other members of the squad to go back to where they came from, though they are members duly elected to the United States fucking Congress from the United States of America. White nationalists, Klansmen, and neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville, Virginia 3 years ago saying, "Jews, you will not replace us," and the president responding, "They are very fine people."
Well,
you know,
speaking of that, I mean, that was partially organized by Richard Spencer, the neo-Nazi, who, as I show in the book, was a friend of Stephen Miller's, the most powerful White House advisor right now. They invited a white nationalist named Peter Brimlow to speak at Duke University. So these groups, you know, white supremacist neo-Nazi groups are very, and you know, there's very clear links between them and the people in the White House. And what I try to do in the book is, you know, to make these links explicit because it's so important for people to connect the dots. And
I have two more questions for you, and then I want to make sure that we respect your time and conclude before the half hour. But talk to me about the fact that this hatred and racism, nativism and intolerance is now armed to the teeth. And you have the president tweeting, "Liberate Virginia, liberate Michigan." And you then have white nationalists in tactical battle gear with weapons of war standing on the State House steps, not there to protest for Second Amendment rights, and that would be bad, but there to use weapons of war to try to intimidate lawmakers to choose a certain political path, which is, to me, a form of terrorism, right? If it's the threat of physical violence in order to achieve a political aim, that shit doesn't work or shouldn't work in a democracy. Talk to me about, and we mentioned the 23 killed by a man with a weapon of war inspired by Trump and Miller here in El Paso, Texas. Talk to me about that dynamic.
well, it is, I mean, it is an incredibly worrisome and troubling dynamic, and it goes back to the psychologies of the people who are in power right now. I mean, Stephen Miller is, you know, from the time he was a teenager, was obsessed with mobster films, and you know, there's nothing wrong with being into mobster movies, but you know, Stephen Miller would like dress up as Robert De Niro's mobster character to go to Las Vegas casinos for his birthdays up into, you know, his 30s. This is, you know, this is a real obsession that the most powerful advisor in the White House has had with this idea of, you know, no real law and order apart from might makes right, which is, you know, what the Republican Party is increasingly adopting as well, and you know what Trump stands for, and this is why you see, you know, these armed groups that they're, you know, encouraging to interfere in the election. And it's just it's so important to understand the psychologies of these people, and you know why they're able to work so effectively together in order that we may respond adequately. I mean, Trump and Stephen Miller have this weird mind meld that I delve into in the book because of the similar values that I talked about. Also, like, Stephen Miller grew up with a father who was described to me as being very Trump-like, you know, was involved in real estate and had numerous legal disputes and bankruptcies related to that. So anyway, the psychologies of these people, I'm trying to understand how they came to to how Stephen Miller and Trump have become such a mutually benefiting danger to our society. It's so important to understand. And but yeah, I mean, they have this mutual fascination with violence that both of them have expressed. I mean, from the time that Stephen Miller was in high school, he would talk about wanting to rip rapists apart piece by piece with his hands, or watch Osama bin Laden's body riddled with bullets. Just very violent, gory language that you see him inserting into Donald Trump's speeches when he tries to demonize migrants by, talking about how migrants slaughter little girls, using really gory, horrific language about, a migrant taking a hammer to a woman's eye sockets, crushing her skull, like stuff that is supposed to incite
Oh yeah,
fear and hatred.
I saw the
And
passage in your book where I forget what show he's on, but he's like, the General Accounting Office estimates that 500,000 American girls are in danger of being genitally mutilated by immigrants coming to this country. And then you break down how he has taken a kernel of truth and then exploited it to these very nativist, racist ends. So two quick questions. One from me, and then I scrolled through all the questions that were posted. One from Tim, who was the first person to ask a question. My question is, Stephen Bannon was arrested yesterday, and you mentioned this kind of litany of father figures or mentors that Stephen Miller has had in his life. You mentioned Horowitz earlier. Bannon certainly was someone who advanced Stephen Miller's career. Stephen Bannon was arrested yesterday for fraud for channeling money from the We Build the Wall crowdfunded border wall project for his own personal use. So thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And then Tim's question, if you want to close it out with this, is what is the most shocking thing that you learned while doing research for this book about Stephen Miller? And for folks who didn't catch this earlier, I'm trying to, there's Amy, she just walked by. This is the book, Hatemonger, Jean Guerrero, and it's Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the white nationalist agenda. All right.
yeah, so I mean, Bannon is one of Stephen Miller's key mentors. He's the one who, when Stephen Miller was working in Congress and was kind of seen as like a fringe character, journalists didn't pay that much attention to him. Steve Bannon came and gave him a platform on Breitbart and essentially gave him free reign over bloggers at Breitbart to shape their coverage. And this is when you see him just pumping them full of white supremacist and white nationalist literature that paints people of color as innately more violent than white people, and just really troubling stuff, and mainstreaming it through Breitbart and turning it into what, the platform of what they call the alt-right, what Steve Bannon called the alt-right. But I mean, for me, like Steve Bannon, he's been really mythologized as, being like a key figure in Trumpism, and he was, but one of the things is he's often painted as having an ideology, but it's very clear when you actually speak to him, and when you look at how he's been indicted on these charges of defrauding people for his own personal benefit, he has no real ideology or belief system. He's a grifter. He's a grifter, just like Donald Trump, and he takes advantage of ideologues and extremists like Stephen Miller, and who like systematically harm people out of this belief that they're saving the United States. And and it's extremely dangerous.
All right, let's close out with Tim's question. What is the most, and there's everything you've told us so far, to a student of history 100 years from now reading about the year 2020, they won't be able to believe this stuff. But of the things you've told us, or maybe something you haven't brought up yet in your research for this book, what was most shocking?
So for me, the most shocking thing, it took me by surprise how much bigger this was than the immigration issue. I mean, I came into this project as an immigration reporter, trying to understand how Stephen Miller had, affected the immigration policy. And, as I learned more and more about Stephen Miller, the more I began to realize, this is a public relations flack who, at the age of 31, with no policy experience, was put in charge of making policies for our country. And when you look at how Donald Trump has consistently, taken advantage of myth makers to have an outsized role in his life, it's not surprising. But Stephen Miller, from his day one in the White House, has done things that, because of his laser focus on targeting families who have, for the most part, not broken any laws, because for him, the goal is, re-engineering the ethnic flows of people into this country rather than actual national security. So because of that, it has left Americans more vulnerable to real threats. And so for me, that was a shocking thing to discover, how systematically he had narrowed the focus of the Department of Homeland Security, turned it into a political weapon that we now see attacking not only immigrant families, but also Black Lives Matter protesters and any of Trump's opponents. So for me, it was realizing how this powerful extremist came in and transformed government into something that has left us in this pandemic, in economic shambles, and it's something that has impacted so many people's lives.
Jean, I love the way that you just put that, and especially the fact that we have now, under the Trump administration, and thanks to Stephen Miller's influence in part, organized our national security apparatus and domestic security towards a threat that by and large does not exist. We know that those in immigrant communities commit crimes at a far lower rate than those who are born in this country. We know that there have been 0 terrorist attacks perpetrated by those who crossed the border with the United States and Mexico. We know that your city, San Diego, my city, El Paso, are among the safest in the United States of America, far safer than cities deeper in the interior. And it's not despite, I would argue it's because we are cities of immigrants. And we are not only stronger and more successful, we are safer as a result of the fact that so many people chose to live here and raise their families here and to get ahead here. And then here's what I think the consequence is. If you are focused where the problem is not, you miss where the problem actually is. You don't see that fucker who just bought an AK-47 online, whose mom called the police department in Allen, Texas and said, "Hey, I need help. My son just bought an AK-47. I don't know what the fuck he needs that thing for. We're not at war. You don't use it to hunt. He doesn't need it for self-defense." And the police department in Allen, Texas says, "Sorry, we can't help you." And then he drives at 600 miles and walks into a Walmart after posting online, what he was doing, walks into a Walmart and kills people, kills 23 people in this community. And I think that's part of the consequences as well, in addition to the inspiration that Miller and Trump provide for these white nationalist terrorists. And in this, you probably saw this. It was, I think last year, they were interviewing the director of the FBI, and he said the single greatest domestic terrorist threat we face is not Al-Qaeda, it's not ISIS, it's not people coming from the northern triangle of Central America. It is domestic white nationalist terrorism. That's the number one threat. And
90% of the crimes committed for this year are right-wing extremists, and 0 from Antifa. So why are we only talking about Antifa?
Right. Because your book just points out that they have been so good, so persistent for so long in creating this false narrative and then literally trying to run the country on it. Well, I'm about 20 pages away from finishing this book. I look forward to doing that, and I've just been really impressed with your research and the way that you've documented it here. And I think it's really helpful for us going into this, the most important election of our lifetimes, to really understand who's running the country right now and based on what motives. And then what happens if we fail in November. It is 4 more years of this, and it gets, in my opinion, much, much worse. So thank you. Thanks for spending the time. Thanks for writing the book. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you in person and getting a chance to hear you again when we can safely travel and we're mobile after this pandemic. So thank you, Jean.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Beto, for everything that you do to bring attention to these issues and for having me on.
Absolutely. Be well. Adios. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, everybody, that was Jean Guerrero, who wrote Hatemonger, and I would show it, but it's going to be backwards if I show it this way. But you can look it up on your favorite bookseller's website, or if your independent local bookstore is still open in the midst of this pandemic, go there and buy it and read it and better understand what we're up against and why this country is experiencing what we're seeing right now. So hope all of you are well and safe and healthy. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great weekend. Adios.